Hey guys, so this video is going to focus on the law of absolute advantage and the law of comparative advantage. And I'm going to show you how to calculate these as well. This has popped up as an exam question before. So first of all, let's start off the law of absolute advantage. The law of absolute advantage states that each country should specialise in the production of that good in which it has absolute advantage. And what we're talking about is a good in which they produce cheaper than others or they use less resources. And this was an idea, or the law itself was developed by Adam Smith. So if we just look at an example here, we can see that when we look at the USA and Brazil, okay, so this is just not a real example. But let's see, we can see that they produce this. So this is really important to note that this is per worker. Okay, so when we look at these figures, it's per worker. Now, this one here might be a crazy figure, but anyway, when we look at this, it's 5 units of clothing per worker. They can produce 12 units of airplanes per worker, whereas Brazil can produce 4 units of clothing and 1 airplane per worker. So we can see here that the USA clearly have an advantage, absolute advantage over the produce of both goods here. So what happens in that case when they have the advantage over both goods? Well, it's not to say that they're going to produce both goods, because when we look at the law of absolute advantage, the law of absolute advantage focuses on the cost itself. So you remember that from our last slide. It focuses on the actual monetary cost. But we know that in producing anything, there are 2 types of cost. There's the financial cost and then there's the opportunity cost. And the law of comparative advantage focuses on lowering the opportunity cost. So in this case, the USA won't produce both clothing and airplanes. They'll produce the one that they're most efficient in and they'll trade for the other good. And just in case you're wondering, well, why won't the USA just produce both clothing and airplanes? There's just one thing we need to remember here is that resources are limited. So when we're talking about the workers as a resource, we know that workers themselves are limited. So you need to use your workers efficiently, and if they produce one good more efficiently, well then you need to focus their production on that good. So then a man by the name of David Ricardo, he went and further investigated that law and came up with the law of comparative advantage. And he said if a country is efficient in producing 2 goods, like we had there with the US, it should specialise in the good where it has the greater relative advantage and trade for other goods. And his idea of the law of comparative advantage, and you can write that in, is that it was to lower the opportunity cost. And that's the main concept of the law of comparative advantage, was to lower the opportunity cost. So just before we look at an example on this, just a couple of assumptions that we're going to take into account for the law of comparative advantage. So first of all, we assume the transport costs are ignored. We are just looking at the cost of producing the good per worker, and that's it. The returns to scale are constant, so we know that the second worker is just as efficient as the first. And we know that that's not always true, but if in this case to simplify the model, we're just going to say that they are constant. We are also going to assume that workers are occupationally mobile. So therefore, when we're talking about the US and Brazil, the workers that previously were making clothes can just quickly swap to airplanes, which again we know is not always true. Strategic consequences of specialisation are ignored. So when we're looking at strategic consequences, we're thinking about things like efficiency. And so the fact that when you become specialised in one good, your workers become more efficient because they're focusing on that good. It also could be economies of scale, which we know are as a result of bulk production. Okay, so particularly if you are focusing your production on one particular sector in the economy, then you're going to incur economies of scale. And then finally, the last thing we assume is that free trade exists. We know that while it exists in the EU, among EU member states, it's not the case with all other trading blocs in the world. So let's have a look at how specialisation encourages international trade. Remember again, you only roughly need about 4 to 5 of these points, but I've just given you a couple of extras so that you can pick the ones that you understand the best. Okay, so let's look at the first one. We can see that greater interdependence with other countries as they need to trade to get goods and services. Interdependence between countries is good because it develops a bond, so that there's good relations between each country. Division of labour, so skills improve as workers now focus on a particular type of labour skill and therefore become more efficient. So we know that that's one of the economies of scale that we see, efficiency. Reduce wastage, so inefficient use of scarce resources. Example being time. So as workers are more efficient, they're going to use their time more efficiently because they're participating in specialisation. But we know that that's partially repetition. So they repeat the same job every day, and obviously as they repeat, the more they repeat it, the better they get at it. Economies of scale, so greater economies of scale may be made available when producing a good for use in other countries. So example, the motor vehicle industry, you can bulk buy the steel as there few countries are going to be are producing for a very wide market. We'll see increased wealth in the country, so increased demand for a product will lead to higher consumer income, therefore increased trade, sales, and then as a result profit. And we also see lower prices, so due to increased efficiency and economies of scale, bulk buying and ability to produce more as a result of efficiency will lead to lower prices. Okay, let's look at the law of comparative advantage in action then. So here we have Ireland and Portugal. We've two goods, candles and water. And we see here Ireland can produce 120 bottles of water per worker. And they can produce 90 candles per worker. Portugal can produce 60 bottles of water per worker, and they can produce 70 candles per worker. So what we can see there is that Ireland actually have absolute advantage. But while Ireland have absolute advantage, they will of course trade, because if they have, let's say, 20 workers creating or making the water and the candles, well then they could make more water per worker than they could candles. So that's an opportunity cost if they go and if they decide to make both. So what they'll do is they'll specialise in one and they'll trade for the other. And I'm going to show you now how to calculate which one they'll actually specialise in. So let's start off with Ireland first. So we can see that 120 bottles of water. So one worker could produce 120 bottles of water or 90 candles. Okay, so let's see how much then it costs a worker to produce one bottle of water if they were the same worker was going to be producing candles. So 120 divided by 120 gives me one bottle of water, and 90 divided by 120 gives me 3/4 candles. So that means for one bottle of water it would cost 3/4. We're missing out on the opportunity cost is 3/4 of a candle. Okay, let's see now how much it would cost us for a worker to produce candles. So 90 divided by 90 to give us one candle, and then we have 120 divided by 90, and that gives us 1.3 bottles of water. So what we can see now is that it costs us more if we produce one candle. So the opportunity cost is more if we produce candles than it is if we produce bottles of water. Okay, and let's look at the opportunity cost for Portugal. So if we look at water, we can see if we divide by 60 to give me one bottle of water, and let that equal to 70 divided by 60. It costs Portugal 1.2 of a candle to produce one bottle of water. So if I have a worker who's producing water, if they produce one bottle of water, that worker could have produced 1.2 of a candle instead. Okay, so then let's look at the candles. So we have 70 divided by 70. Let that equal to 60 divided by 70. And 70 divided by 70 gives me one candle, and 60 divided by 70 gives me 0.85 bottles of water. So what we can see here is that it costs, the opportunity cost of producing a candle is less than the opportunity cost of producing a bottle of water. So what can we take from that? Well, Ireland, what they're going to produce is they are going to produce water, because their opportunity cost is less. It's only 3.4 or 3/4 of a candle. Whereas Portugal, they're going to produce candles. And both countries then, what they'll do is they'll trade for the good that they don't produce. So the big question here then is, do Ireland and Portugal benefit from trade? Well, if we just go back to our um, opportunity costs here, we've said that Ireland will produce water and they'll trade for candles. And the main thing is that when they are trading for candles, provided that the Ireland give less than 1.3 bottles of water to Portugal for their one candle, then Ireland will benefit from trade. Similarly, when we look at Portugal, they're going to produce candles and they're going to trade for water. As long as Portugal give less candles, that's 1.2 candles for water, then they benefit from trade. Because otherwise, if for example they had to give 1.3 candles for a bottle of water, then they would have been better off just producing water themselves.